I feel as certain today as I did 3 years ago that in a democracy, if you give people a choice, you have a duty to implement what they decide. I have done my best to do that.
She resigned from office on a bitter note. Her tenure dominated by what was largely regarded as failure after failure in the drama of one of the most divisive, confusing, and heavily covered news events of the past few years: the country's impending exit from the European Union. So much so that this became one of her catchphrases.
Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. I'm very clear, Brexit does mean Brexit.
With mantras like that and a front row seat to one of the biggest political crises since the Second World War, it's easy to picture UK Prime Minister Theresa May only within the context of Brexit. But she's been in the political world for more than 20 years, making headlines for everything from calling out her own party for its prejudice and backwards outlook, to suffering the biggest parliamentary defeat of any sitting government in UK history, to her unique dance moves. So we wanted to know, what propelled Theresa May to the top of the political ladder, and what bumps did she face along the way? Born the daughter of an Anglican vicar and raised in the English district of Oxfordshire, then Theresa Brazier was instilled with an early duty to public service. She was an only child who reportedly had aspirations of becoming the first woman prime minister from an early age. Margaret Thatcher would later beat her to it, but young Theresa followed in her footsteps, attending Oxford University. She joined the Conservative Party, often referred to as Tory Party, before she was even a teenager.
So Theresa May was a really geeky child. This was the late 1960s. There were other teenagers that were out protesting about the bomb, or in Paris taking to the streets. Theresa May was just quietly plodding along, working for the party, and she didn't really ever stop.
Despite her political ambitions, May didn't jump straight in. Following graduation, she actually went to work for the Bank of England in 1977. It would take almost 15 years for her to run for a parliamentary seat. In 1992, after serving several years as a councillor in a London borough, she stood for what was largely seen as an unwinnable seat in northwest Durham. She lost, and lost again, in a special election in '94. But things turned around for May in 1997, when she won her first parliamentary seat in Maidenhead. As the Labour Party's Tony Blair became Prime Minister under the slogan, "Things can only get better," and while many Conservatives were being voted out, Theresa May was just getting started. She was one of only 13 women Conservative MPs, comprising less than 8% of the party's representatives.
In the symbol of the maiden's head, it is entirely appropriate that it should now be represented by a maiden.
So once it was a very male party, it was a very middle class, white party. Theresa May comes along, she's a disruptor just by the fact that she's a woman. She becomes an outsider.
A couple years later, she joined the Shadow Cabinet, which is basically a cabinet of members from the opposition party who would hold office if their party were in power. By 2002, she was the first woman chair of the Conservative Party and was quick to bluntly call for reforms, deeming the party's base to be, quote, too narrow.
You know what some people call us? The nasty party.
She served in the trenches of the opposition until 2010, when Conservative leader David Cameron became Prime Minister, ending 13 years of Labour Party rule. That year, May was appointed Home Secretary, overseeing areas like crime and immigration. It was a position that had seen crisis after crisis under Labour. She'd go on to become one of the country's longest-serving people in this position.
Where you might get another politician who has a vision of how they want to change the country, they might be good in a department like welfare or education, where you can really reorder things. In the Home Office, you probably just need someone who's quite functional. They can just be the boss and tell everyone else what to do. And I think those were her strengths.
But her legacy would prove to be multifaceted, and at times, contentious. She pledged early on to get the net number of immigrants coming into the UK annually to the tens of thousands, which she ultimately failed to do, and would have never been able to do with free movement from the European Union. In 2012, May explained that her approach was, quote, to create a hostile environment for migrants in the country illegally, even at one time reportedly overseeing a billboard campaign warning them to, quote, go home or face arrest. May's advisor later claimed that she tried to block the campaign. But she also took on issues that weren't perfectly aligned with traditional conservative values. Despite previously voicing support for legislation that prohibited the, quote, promotion of homosexuality in schools,
the problem with this government is it is constantly imposing and prescribing what should happen in schools.
she eventually became one of the first senior conservatives to support gay marriage.
Marriage should be for everyone. And that's why I'm coming out for marriage.
And while some have disputed how much of a feminist she really is, she's promoted women within her own party and co-founded an organization called Women to Win to help advance women to conservative MP positions. She drew attention to female genital mutilation, making reporting the practice to police mandatory for health professionals. And then she took on the issue of police corruption in response to, among other things, racial profiling and discrimination. In 2014, she announced that as many as 250,000 street searches had probably been carried out illegally in the year prior, with Black people being 7 times more likely than white people to be stopped. May invited outside investigators to look into officer misconduct and formulated a new code of ethics, which included mandating unconscious bias training as part of a review on the use of stop and search.
If you do not change of your own accord, we will impose change on you.
Some dispute how impactful these policies actually were. Data published as recently as 2018 shows Black people are being disproportionately targeted by stop and search at higher rates than when these reforms began. Despite her controversial legacy, she managed to cling to the role longer than any other Home Secretary since World War II. And then, rather suddenly, came her biggest ascension of all, to the role she'd coveted since childhood: Prime Minister.
Together, we will build a better Britain.
Her predecessor, David Cameron, stepped down unexpectedly following the referendum in 2016, in which the UK voted 51.9% to 48.1% to leave the European Union. May assumed the role of Prime Minister after her only opponent withdrew from the race to become Conservative Party leader.
It's almost Theresa May's tragedy that she did come to power as a result of Brexit, because almost uniquely for a senior politician from her party, she's actually never been that interested in Europe.
As Home Secretary, she was primarily focused on domestic policy. Now she was in charge of delivering on the most divisive and high-stakes referendums in UK history: to leave the EU. Ironic, given the fact that she'd actually campaigned for the Remain side.
Remaining inside the European Union does make us more secure. It does make us more prosperous, and it does make us more influential beyond our shores.
In the years since the Brexit vote, she's negotiated with Parliament and the EU in an effort to arrange a deal that both sides would agree on. Resultantly, every deal she attempted to pass failed. In March 2019, she offered to resign if the latest version of her deal passed. It didn't. It's also worth noting that not long after the Brexit vote, she became the first world leader to meet with US President Donald Trump after his inauguration. And despite hopes of a US-UK trade deal that would offset the losses of leaving the EU, she didn't really establish a rapport with Trump.
This was your choice of a question. There goes that relationship.
What's largely been viewed as a failure in leadership has dominated headlines, as well as sucked up most of May's time.
She had lots of changes she wanted to do in the education system. Housing has been something that's been sitting around that needs reforming. The public sector needs reforming. Nothing has happened in any of those.
And then, on May 24th, 2019, the Prime Minister succumbed to the mounting pressure and defeat.
It is, and will always remain, a matter of deep regret to me that I have not been able to deliver Brexit. I will shortly leave the job that it has been the honour of my life to hold. The second female Prime Minister, but certainly not the last. I do so with no ill will, but with enormous and enduring gratitude to have had the opportunity to serve the country I love.
You know, our media can often express far more sympathy for the powerful. In her case, she will lead, no doubt, a comfortable and affluent life to her very end, rather than the victims of their policies, who, I'm afraid, have been driven into misery, insecurity and turmoil as a direct result.
It's unclear what's in store for the future of the country's leadership. But what is clear is that whatever happens to Theresa May, Brexit may very well be her lasting legacy.